Rationalization, as we use it in contemporary English, usually doesn't mean making something rational, which would be good. It means convincing yourself something's rational after you've already done it, which is presumably bad.
The Rational View is a weekly series hosted by me, Dr. Alan Scott, providing a rational, evidence-based perspective addressing important societal issues. Hello and welcome to another episode of The Rational View. I'm your host, Dr. Al Scott. On this episode, I've always been interested in the quest for rationality in public policy, and I've surprisingly encountered resistance here and there amongst people saying that humans are at their core irrational beings. This may be true. What is the proper balance then between logic and emotion in rational decision-making? Wanting to explore this topic, I've sought out an expert. As always, if you like what you're hearing, please give me a like on your podcast app. You can join the discussion at Facebook/groups/The Rational View. I'd love to hear from you. Justin E.H. Smith is professor of the history and philosophy of science at the University of Paris. He is the author, among other books, of Irrationality, A History of the Dark Side of Reason, and of the forthcoming The Internet is Not What You Think It Is. He writes a regular Substack newsletter at https://justinehsmith.substack.com. Dr. Smith, welcome to The Rational View.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me.
I appreciate you coming on the show to talk to me. So I've always been interested in rationality. The name of the podcast is The Rational View, and I saw your book on irrationality and read a little bit about it, and it seemed very topical for the podcast. And I've been looking at the philosophy of thought a little bit. I'm not a philosopher. I'm a doctor of philosophy, but I'm a physicist. So,
Okay.
To start us off, could you tell our listeners a little bit about your background and how you came to be professor of philosophy and science?
I did a PhD in philosophy some years ago at Columbia University in New York, where I worked for some years on the philosophy of Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who was a 17th century German philosopher, mathematician, linguist, inventor, and diplomat, and many other things besides. Leibniz was also a member of the school of thought that we usually call the rationalists, alongside René Descartes and Baruch Spinoza. There are some other figures who were part of this same movement, but those are the big three. And Leibniz, I would describe as a hardcore rationalist. You cannot get any more hardcore than Leibniz. But what exactly that means, I think, would take more than the time we have to spell out. But one thing that I would say is that Leibniz believes, as a rationalist, that the most important knowledge that we have is prior to experience, and that it shapes our experiences rather than our inferences coming to us through experience. So logic and the imposition of the logic that comes, as it were, pre-stocked in our minds on the world is crucial for him. So that was many years ago, and I have developed in all sorts of different directions. I also work extensively in the history of science as opposed to, or as distinct from, the history of philosophy. And it's in that capacity that I moved to the University of Paris in 2012, where I work in a department of history and philosophy of science.
I see. Okay, very interesting. So yeah, I happened across your book, History of the Dark Side of Reason, and it seemed very intriguing to me because it's something I'd been thinking about as well, and how current events seem to be going away from rationality
Mhm.
in a lot of cases.
Yeah.
Uh, could you maybe give our listeners a little thesis of your book?
Sure. I suppose it is a book that's written in a dialectical fashion, which is not terribly popular these days. And what I mean by this is that I don't rigidly and uniformly defend a single thesis. Rather, I move through a thesis and its opposite in order then to see if I can come through to a, as it were, a higher order synthesis or resolution of the tension between those two. And the main tension driving the entire book is the opposition between rationality and irrationality. Now, I just said that I've done a lot of my scholarly work on the philosophy of Leibniz, who was a rationalist. I'm very sympathetic to him. I am not, however, myself a thoroughgoing rationalist. I am not a Leibnizian, more particularly. Why not? Well, because I think that the commitment to rationality as the solution to all of our problems is something that is going to bring us up short. And I have some particular examples of this that I can get to. Leibniz, for example, thought that we could resolve all social, political, diplomatic problems by a sort of reasoning that he referred to as calculation, or what we might also translate as reckoning. And he thought that this could be done by means of machines. That is to say, we could input our respective diplomatic positions into reckoning engines, and they would churn out for us the kind of final solution to the question, which side of this dispute between two empires about to go to war is right. And that would resolve the problem and we would have world peace. If we could just figure out how to outsource a bit more of our power of reasoning to reckoning engines, we will have never-ending world peace.
It
Now,
has some
the way
interesting
I see,
parallels to the artificial intelligence work that's being done, and the
yeah,
narrow
yeah,
artificial intelligences are becoming very powerful and smarter than people in certain narrow
yeah,
fields. They can beat the world chess champion, and
yeah,
so
yeah,
these
yeah,
super intelligent but somewhat psychotic narrow AIs.
yeah, yeah,
They
yeah,
don't
yeah,
have the emotional uh, parallels to human
right,
reasoning, and they end
right.
up giving you somewhat psychotic solutions in a lot of cases.
Right, right, right. I mean, here on things like being beat by a computer at chess, I'm inclined to agree with the philosopher John Searle, who said that you should no more worry that the computer is smarter than you when it beats you at chess than you should worry. Imagine you get like a 20-meter tall iron tower on wheels and you put a football on top of the tower, and then the iron tower on wheels rolls across the football field while all these tiny little men are trying to tackle it. Obviously, they're not going to succeed, but no one would even bother to worry that for that reason, the Iron Tower is better at football than they are, right?
Mhm.
The worry just wouldn't even come up,
It's very
right?
narrow.
Yeah, and because it's very narrow, and what it was built to do is something that's so far from what we mean by football, and arguably Similarly, when Deep Blue simply runs through at a massive speed all the possible moves on the chessboard, that's not what we mean by playing chess either, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a long question, but indeed, I am I don't I'm not committed to the idea that there is a special mysterious je ne sais quoi that makes a human mind what it is. I think it's an open question whether the 100 billion neurons in the human brain can be emulated in a silicon based system, or by string and toilet paper rolls or whatever. Those are open questions, right? But what we know for now is that the way the human mind processes the world is, from the starting point, from the very first steps you would take in putting it together, a different kind of system than a computer. And for that reason, I'm not worried or enthused about anything like a looming singularity or the dawning of consciousness of the machines. That's not to say that machines can't make our lives a living hell, can't dominate us in a certain way. It's just they're not going to dominate us because they become conscious.
I've spent some time looking into this in a previous series of podcasts,
Mm-hmm.
and there is some interesting work being done on simulating emotional decision making.
Yeah,
And that seems much more human in its responses than the narrow AIs that the vast majority of computer scientists have been working on. So
yeah,
it was an interesting realization that by simulating emotion and giving it uh, graphs basically which connect thoughts to human-like emotions as input. So it's
yeah,
giving human-like emotional weight to the inputs, then the outputs become much more human in their understanding and their
yeah,
seeing. And I thought, well, okay, this is one of the things that caused me to come looking about, okay, well, maybe obviously rationality isn't what's making human decisions, or
yeah,
the narrow AIs would seem more human, and they don't.
yeah.
They seem
Right,
alien. And
right,
so
right,
that
right.
made me question, because I've always held out rationality as an ideal to be worked at as well. And,
Yeah,
similar to Leibniz, you
yeah,
strive to be rational in your decision making. You want your public policy to be rational.
yeah.
You want your risk analyses to be rational and not emotional. I've always kind of idolized Mr. Spock from Star Trek. The
Yeah,
Vulcan was what humanity should be, right? But what is
yeah,
the
yeah.
proper balance, right? How
Yeah,
does
I mean,
emotion enter?
maybe it's best to think in terms of balance. One of the things that keeps coming back in the book is um, a lot depends what we mean by rationality. And it's pretty easy, at least for human beings, if not for Vulcans or androids, to eliminate the kind of emotionless, merely calculative form of life as the most rational one. Why? Well, because it doesn't work, right? It will come back to bite you. You'll traumatize yourself and have a nervous breakdown eventually. And I don't know, not necessarily, but it's at least something will go wrong if you suppress emotion, right? So then,
Mm-hmm.
arguably, the best, most rational form of life is the one that figures out how to most productively and successfully modulate, manage the passionate, emotional dimensions of existence that you are subject to simply because you've got hormones rushing through you, and you're, again, not put together in the same way that an ideal machine would be, right?
Yes, yes. I mean, are emotion-based decisions irrational?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, they can also, and there's a lot of this the history of moral philosophy, David Hume, for example, explicitly argued that reason should be a slave of the passions, not because he wanted life to be disorderly and chaotic, but just because human beings are passionate beings, and the passions will do a better job of guiding you. And you see this, in various strands of moral philosophy today, including, say, in conservative thought, the idea that disgust is a reliable indicator of moral offensiveness. I personally disagree with that view, because I think disgust is wrapped up with things we also find highly pleasurable. That's why we like disgusting food, like lobster and stuff like that, because it's right at the boundary between being revolting and being wonderful.
Ah,
But still, the idea that disgust is a reliable guide to leading the moral life is an example of a very very thoroughgoing attempt to incorporate emotion, passion, because disgust is a passion in the sense that it bowls you over, whether you want to be disgusted or not, to incorporate this into, legal frameworks, into legal decisions about gay marriage, things like that. So
yes.
it's a real ongoing debate that kind of shows how people legitimately, whether their conclusions are right or not, legitimately kind of recognize the limits of rationality in fundamental human decision making.
Yeah, I just watched the biography Mr. Jones about the Soviet Holodomor and the
Oh
famines in the
yeah,
Ukraine caused by,
yeah,
ideology trumping reason and rationality.
yeah,
And this is
yeah.
one of the reasons I'm doing this podcast. I see
Mhm.
the damage that can happen when politicians are given the power to implement ideologies without
Yeah,
regard for science and rationality. I'm sure you
yeah,
probably have examples in your book about
yeah.
how that
Well, I
goes.
mean, sure, sure. In fact, I mean, the book is structured in there's, it kind of opens with a legend, a Pythagorean philosopher named Hippasus, Hippasus of Metapontum, uh, supposedly divulged to outsiders the mystery of irrational numbers, which, story goes, had been invented, or no, sorry, invented, discovered by the Pythagoreans, and it freaked them out, right? Because if the square, or sorry, the square of the diagonal is a non-terminating decimal series, that means basically reality just doesn't make any sense, right? And so they wanted to keep this absolutely secret. Hippasus goes and divulges it. His fellow Pythagoreans learn that this is what he did. They say, "Hey, Hippasus, let's go out fishing." They take him out in a fishing boat, and then when they're out in the middle of the water, they hold his head under the water and drown him. That's the
Yikes.
story. But and it shows how well. It shows a couple of things. It shows how seriously people have taken things that to us today seem trivial, but also the Pythagoreans were, among other things, an extremist religious sect that was hyper devoted to rationality, right?
This was against
And
their religion, the irrational numbers. They
yeah,
discovered
yeah,
it, and it was a horrible secret, a horrible, dirty
yeah, yeah,
secret
yeah,
amongst
yeah.
them.
But also, in the end, what they were also devoted to is a form of orderly, rationally structured living, right? And so this legend reveals a kind of is a kind of pattern that I think keeps coming back again and again, where people become so devoted to this ideal of rational ordering of society that when it starts to break down, they engage in a bloodfest. And this happens in the Bolshevik Revolution. It happens in the French Revolution, and the French Revolution is a wonderful example of this because you've got people loudly proclaiming the values of enlightenment while they're chopping people's heads off right and left, and then inevitably getting their own heads chopped off too. It was a bloody mess. I mean, in terms of numbers, I think it was like 25,000 beheadings in Paris between 1791 and 93. That's not a huge number in terms, if you compare it with Ukrainian famine or other modern massacres. But it was so directly connected to the rhetoric of enlightenment and reason that it's really worth studying. And so, that's kind of that's getting closer to the heart of my thesis. Like, I don't want government by theocrats who despise science and say everything is in God's hands. Let's just sit back and pray or something like that. That's like, aggressive irrationalism that we see in various parts of the world, including my home country. I don't want that, but what we also see is that simply declaring loyalty to rationality as the solution to all of our social problems is always inevitably going to come back to bite us as well. So indeed, what we need is something more like an Aristotelian ideal of practical wisdom, knowing what to do in situations that doesn't suppress passions so much as, again, modulates them.
So the evolutionary background brings emotion with it, and we all would like to be making decisions that are in line with our emotional needs and wants.
Yeah.
But that can also lead us astray.
Yeah.
Because now you have bias. I mean, that's identified as bias in the scientific method.
Yeah.
So I struggle with bringing that in as a component of decision making. We all like to have our emotions aligned with our logic. That's the best situation for whoever is doing it, and that a lot of people just lazily go along with that without thinking.
And I think now also there's an additional species of bias that is peculiar to our, let's say, our information environment, which is that it's so easy now to pull up and to share on social media a scientific study that more or less agrees with the point that you all already want to make, right?
Cherry picking is very easy.
And how to control this is a problem that that can't simply fall to science itself, because in a sense science just gives us no real guidelines, political or ethical, for navigating bias. We can study bias scientifically. It's fascinating, to see, especially in social media meme culture over the past few years, the rise of memes that are humoristic variations on the trolley problem. The Philippa Foot's famous kind of thought experiment. If you can shift a trolley onto another track that will kill one person, or leave it on the same track and it will kill 5 people, should you kill that one person? Now, this is so popular right now because it's a central part of AI ethics. In particular, the trolley has morphed into a self-driving car.
Yes.
And so these are very practical problems. But there's a lot more, in Philippa Foot in the 1960s surely saw this, there's a lot more to ethics than just solving the trolley problem. And indeed, it might be, at least in terms of absolute moral principles, it might be unsolvable, right? You know, there might not be an answer to it. And the idea that you can just take up this problem, think about it, think about its variations, and then implement it in reality in the form of self-driving cars is pretty pretty dispiriting in my view.
And it's also, it's a difficult problem. It's not
Yeah,
a straightforward answer, and the people that are implementing these questions are implementing the answers to these questions are not philosophers of morality. And in
yeah,
most cases, they are, a small subset of engineers, which are
yeah.
highly selected
Well,
individuals.
I think there's more and more cross fertilization between academic philosophy and the tech world. Indeed, the tech world is now poaching some ethicists from academia. Um, but of course, the problem, and similarly in academic moral philosophy, people are increasingly constrained to talk about problems that are passed down from the people who make the real decisions in the tech world. Um, and the problem is, that, of course, that they in that world are driven by, at the end of the day, by a lust for profit, and
Mhm.
they'll always find a way around any of the ethical concerns we
Yeah.
have. And so ethics becomes more kind of a branch of public relations more than anything. What's ethical? Well, whatever we're able to get away with without too much public outcry.
Well, that's actually very human, because I think
Yeah,
in humans we make emotional decisions, and the rational part of us is used to justify why we did that.
yeah, 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 yeah,
There's
yeah,
actually an
yeah, yeah,
analogy
yeah,
here.
yeah, yeah. I mean, that's such an interesting fact that the term rationalization, as we use it in contemporary English, usually doesn't mean making something rational, which would be good. It means convincing yourself something's rational after you've already done it, which is presumably bad. I find
Yeah,
that
no,
fascinating.
it's a big problem, and we pay the price for irrational decisions
Yeah,
in politics.
yeah, 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 yeah. I mean, one, I guess to get back more to the question, what do we do with emotion? What do we do about the fact that we're not entirely rational? One of the key themes of the book is that well, typically in economics is a wonderful example of this, or related fields like game theory or rational choice theory or decision theory. It's easiest to take it for granted, to just state at the outset that the kind of idealized rational agents that we're imagining in this thought experiment uh, are such that they want to maximize their profits and to live as long as possible, right? That and so for in many contexts, for many kind of rather formalized fields of academic inquiry into rationality, that's just what rationality is. It's wanting to get rich and live long, right? And we know, of course, that this doesn't always hold. And in the book, I give the example of, let's say someone is an ascetic monk. and say a Franciscan or something, and they've taken a vow of poverty. If anyone tries to give them money, they think it's dirty, and it makes them feel bad, right? There are people who feel bad when people give them money. So try to set up a logic puzzle with such a person and tell them, if you get this right, you'll win $1 million, right? Now, there's a case of someone who is going to evade the right answer just to not get stuck with $1 million. And the fact that human beings are complex in that way, also altruism, self-sacrifice, sometimes we do things for others that really do not maximize our own benefit, but we do this. Why do we do this? Well, strictly speaking, altruism is irrational at an individual level, right? But there's another factor, which is that we're mortal, and that anyone who's really paying attention has to have the dawning awareness of the fact that it's pretty hard, or has to have at least a suspicion that simply indefinitely extending out whatever I've got going right now that I call my life can't in itself be good, right? And because it's like if that were the case, then a person who lives 90 years will necessarily have more good than a person who lives 40 years. And we know that that's not always true. We know that that's that it's just a basic misunderstanding of the goodness of life to measure the length of it, right? I mean, of course, longevity is good in a sense, but it's not the only thing. So you're really forced very quickly when you're thinking about such things, about the limits of rational choice theory to really accommodate what a human being is, you're forced pretty quickly to start thinking about some pretty deep existential questions that invariably touch on the kind of the horizon of our mortality as something that shapes our lives. Right?
You can value. I mean, the question is, what metric do you use to value life, and how do you score points in that? And money is one metric, I guess, that you could use. But I think a better metric would be personal freedom maximization. And that's why you're seeking money, is to maximize personal freedom. And I think that gets past your ascetic monk issue.
Yeah. Right. Perhaps. Yeah. I mean, in a sense, the kind of the asceticism as a form of life, or when monks go begging, or when the ancient cynics like Diogenes of Sinope and others, the famous story of Diogenes of Sinope, when Alexander the Great learns about him and says, I have to go meet this wisest of men. Diogenes is lying in the gutter at the marketplace, wearing like an animal hide, just completely unkempt and looking like a beast. And Alexander the Great says to Diogenes, you are the wisest of men. Your reputation has extended throughout the whole world. Tell me what you want, and it shall be yours. And Diogenes looks up at him and he says, get out of my light. Right? That's what he wants. And indeed, Alexander gives it to him. He steps out of Diogenes' light. And that's such a wonderful example because, indeed, the idea is that if you really understand what freedom is, then you really don't want anything, right? Is that more rational? Some of the cynics took this to ridiculous excesses, right? Like they thought, oh, cooking is just a ridiculous social convention. It's a nicety. It doesn't really change anything. One of them goes and tries to eat a live octopus from a tide pool. And, it's just crazy because you realize, like, okay, it's not that you've got just pure like rational right conduct of life on the one hand, and a bunch of arbitrary social conventions on the other hand. It's more like you've got a complex interweaving between these two, where many social conventions start as a way of helping us through the world, and then they get carried away into something that doesn't make any sense, but neither does it make any sense to give them up altogether, right? Um, and so it's hard to just remove yourself from all of the irrational, arbitrary things people in our civilized world do, right?
Yeah. So does that, it doesn't leave us any closer to getting to an agreed system of public policy that gives us the
Yeah.
best answers. And
No,
unfortunately,
no. I mean, I actually, with public policy, I've been thinking about this a lot. I know some people, and I follow the arguments of people who are really pro-nuclear, as an environmental, a long-term environmental strategy to cut CO2 emissions. We wouldn't have any of this ecological crisis if the lefties hadn't shut down the nuclear power path over several decades. And I've been thinking about this a lot. I am strongly against nuclear power. And then when I try to find a good rational basis for that, it's because I'm risk averse. Because we don't know what the future is going to be like. Nuclear power plants have to be maintained in order for disasters to be averted. We don't know for how long people are going to have their act together sufficiently to keep them maintained as they have to be, right? So that inclines me towards the kind of ecological thinking that these friends and associates of mine think is a hopeless dead end, right? And it's a really, really interesting case study because if you're just trying to say we need to listen to reason, I'm like, okay, I still don't know what we should do.
yeah. Well, you've touched a nerve, because I'm probably identify as an eco-modernist myself,
Uh-huh.
and I am on the side that believes that nuclear power is the best way
Mm-hmm.
to prevent carbon buildup in the
Yeah.
atmosphere,
Okay.
and
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
address
Yeah.
the realities of modern life with power.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And we're seeing it in Ontario right now. We had the Green Energy Act was introduced by an ideologically motivated government, and now we're paying through the nose for it.
Yeah.
And they're
Mm-hmm.
they're planning on shutting down nuclear facilities and trying to replace them with wind, and some uh, Rube Goldberg scenario with wind and water and batteries. And
Yeah, I mean, you could be right. Again, I'm in suspension on this, and I bring it up more as a case study. But when you're looking at, say, the like total rationalization of, in the good sense, not the sense of uh, ad hoc justification for what you've done wrong, but the total rationalization of, let's say, commercial air travel over the past several decades. We're now at a point where you can tweak something a little bit, but that tweak would have just as much of a likelihood of an unintended harm further down the line in terms of safety, right? We saw
sure.
that when they added bolt the possibility to bolt the door of the cockpit after September 11th,
Yes,
and
yes.
then the Germanwings pilot bolted the door when he committed suicide in the Germanwings plane in the French Alps a few years ago. Like, you can
Yes,
try to
yes.
eliminate risk, but that attempt itself will bring about new risks. But in the airline industry, what we have is, something that is known. We know what this thing is. Where it's a lot harder, I think, is when we are kind of sticking ourselves with something that's not, an 8-hour flight, but is, 10 or 20,000 years into the future, where you just can't anticipate all of the possible consequences over such a vast time scale, right?
Yeah.
That's my main concern.
It reminds me a little bit about the flying versus driving thing. Statistically,
Mhm.
we know flying is a much safer way to go long distances than driving.
Yeah,
Yet after
yeah,
the 9/11 airplane hijackings, many people said, I'm not going to fly because it's too dangerous. And
yeah,
the number of deaths as a result of the people driving instead of flying was much larger than the actual
yeah,
terrorism incident.
yeah,
And
yeah,
I see, like looking at the numbers, trying to look at, what
yeah,
is the safest way forward. Nuclear is right now the safest way to make
yeah,
power in large
yeah,
amounts. Yes, it's
yeah, yeah,
hazardous and it needs to be managed. Obviously, that's the main issue is what are the potential um, drawbacks of mismanagement, because it's a
yeah,
human,
yeah, yeah.
any human
And we
thing can be
are,
mismanaged, right?
yeah. And we are really, really bad at assessing risks. I mean, I always find it astounding that that the number of people we're willing to see die in traffic fatalities. It's such a high number, a number that we would never tolerate for air travel, and why this has not become an issue, an issue of grave concern for society, is really, really very interesting.
Yes, yes.
I would add, though, that I myself suffer from severe fear of flying. And I have been, I've had a year of respite now because we haven't been able to travel. And it's transformed me. I used to have regular recurring nightmares about being in a plane that was crashing, and those nightmares have gone away.
That's good.
I used to fly all the time, and I was always terrified, and I was always among the 0.0001% best informed about airline safety statistics, and
Yep,
I
yep.
I would always get furious when people would learn that I was terrified of flying and start telling me about statistics, and I'm like, I
It
could
doesn't
beat
help,
you.
right? It's an
Yeah, I could
emotional
beat you in a
response.
statistics game. Yeah. And there's a case where I would really like to have the whatever part of my brain is responsible for that emotional response. I would like to have it removed. I'd like to just have it taken out and transformed into something more Spock-like.
Yeah, and as pro-nuclear advocates, we come up against that fear in nuclear as well, and
Mm.
it's a difficult thing. You can't just quote facts to these people.
Yeah.
It doesn't work. It doesn't convince people. It makes them shell up and and justify.
Right.
Justify.
Yeah. Like, again, people are really bad at assessing risk.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the problems that I'm hoping to solve with this podcast. And all I can do is try to dig into the issues and ask questions and have more people thinking about the issues. I think that's maybe the best way forward at this point. And
yeah, certainly.
so we're kind of coming to the end of our time here, and I've really had a good time talking with you about rationality. It's I appreciate you coming on the show. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks again. Thanks for having me.
If you're enjoying what you're hearing, please consider visiting my Patreon page and becoming a patron of this podcast at patron.podbean.com/therationalview.